All right, good morning, guys. We're back with this lawnmower engine, and I read your comments and suggestions from this past week again, and we're going to take a look at some of those things. Two of you, we'll just start off. A couple of you noticed that on the carburetor, the pin that holds the float was a little bit loose, a little bit out, and you talked about the potential of flooding if that float's not working correctly, because remember, that float bowl is going to fill up with fuel and almost act as a secondary holding tank, and then the emulsion tube is going to suck fuel out of that bowl. So if it if it floods with too much fuel, then the system's not going to work right. So I did fix that. I just pushed the pin in there. I will tell you the pin was pretty tight, so I don't know that it was flopping loose, but nonetheless a good catch. Another one of you, I don't remember who, mentioned checking the piston rings, and I think that's something that if you continue to go down the line and you don't find the issue, then that's certainly something we could look at. But last week, if you remember, I think it was Jacob Guerrero suggested checking compression, and so we did that, and compression was great. It was better than you'd expect on an engine this old, and I think that's a pretty good indicator that there's probably not something wrong with the rings. Could there be? Sure. We don't know for sure, but the fact that the compression was holding pretty steady, and I tested it at least 5 times, and it was always consistent in that same range. So I don't remember who that was, but I think it's a good suggestion, but it's maybe one that's a little farther down the line. A majority of you, there's only 5 students that completed it on time, but several of you said, hey, we've got good compression. Now that we know we've got at least a little bit of spark, let's go back to the fuel system. And that's exactly where your brain should have been. Go back to the fuel system. So I did that. I reinstalled the carburetor. Put the carburetor back on. Put the fuel line on. Filled the tank up with some fuel. Check the oil. And what I'm going to show you now is to see if we're getting fuel into this engine. Now it's a little more challenging because it's just me. You know, a lot of times if you have another person, one person can pull the engine over, another one can look in the carburetor and see if you're getting any fuel out of that emulsion tube. You'll see it. It'll look like a little water fountain coming up. So being that it's just me, I'm going to use a little paper towel, almost like a wick, and then I'll stuff that into the carburetor throat, and I'm going to pull the engine over. Now the spark plug's out. There's no spark plug in the engine, so it's not going to start. And the air cleaner's off, the air filter's off. You can see I still don't have everything on the engine. What I'm trying to see here is, are we getting fuel? And if you can see that discoloration there on the top, that's all fuel. So what this tells us is that the carburetor, if nothing else, is holding fuel in the fuel float bowl, and it's drawing fuel up through that emulsion tube, and so the needle valve is working, at least seems to be, which is a really good sign. So maybe those of you that suggested taking the carburetor off and giving it a good clean, at least at face value here, that seems to be a good suggestion. So we've got a little bit of spark, our compression's good, we know we're getting fuel at least into the throat of the carburetor. It would be it would be something that, unless there's something else going on, we should have what we need: fuel, spark, compression, to at least get this engine to want to kick over. It might not sustain itself, but it might kick over. Now, next week is going to be our last week of looking at this engine, and so based on what you've seen this week, make suggestions. And I know at this point the suggestions might be pretty obvious, but I want to see what you all suggest for me to do. But this is what I read based on your suggestions this week, and a lot of you said go back to the fuel system and see if you're getting any fuel up through that carburetor. So that's where I'm gonna leave you this week. Nice and short video. I just want you to tell me what you think we should do next week, the last and final week, and we'll go from there. You also have an assignment, the second class for Diesel 101, and he's going to focus on valves and the valve train in this video, and then we'll have one more next week on the crankshaft. All right, hope everyone's doing well. If you have any questions, email me. Other than that, we'll talk to you next week.